Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. That was a perfect segue to what I'm going to talk about. You won't know much about me. I'm not a developer. I'm not a publisher. And I'm not in the business world. I make books. These are books. That's a book. This is a book I made 42 years ago. So I spent 40 years making letterpress books. So when I say I want to talk to you about a book, I mean real books. And I mean to say that when somebody says a book is a long-form text, I practically go homicidal. A book is not a long-form text. A book is a structured sequence of intertextual components that have a structured relationship to each other, each of which is coded in order to participate in the semantic field of the book as a whole. So, this book was one of my first textual experiences. It transformed my life. It's Ut Pictura Poesis. I had never seen a book with a scholarly apparatus. I thought, oh my God, look at that. Every word, every passage, every piece of the text is related to some other passage, some other author, some other text. It's a living thing. It's a tissue. It's a network. It's alive. I was 10 years old. This is long before the internet. It's long before HyperCard. It's long before hypertext. So my relationship to books, therefore, involves my work as an artist, my work as a writer, and my work as a scholar and teacher and pedagogue. In all of those roles, one of the things I'm interested in thinking about is the way in which format features are related to functionality, how they came into being, how they were designed, and how they serve cognitive purposes as well as semantic ones. The work of the great medievalist Malcolm Parks is particularly useful in looking at the ways in which the scholarly apparatus that we take for granted came into being in the changes in reading practices between the 10th and 12th centuries. So when you look at a page like this and you think about its organization and understand that every hierarchical unit of space is encoded with a role, that gives you a very different sense of how to interpret format. So also, when I hear people talking about the absence of format and the need and the lack of need for format features for authors, that has something only to do with design, again, I go slightly homicidal. Luckily, I'm not armed. A couple more books of mine, and then I'm going to launch into telling you about a couple of projects I've done and the project I'm working on that extends these principles and ideas into a new relationship between books and browsers in which actual books will continue to play a role. This is a printed book I did, letterpress. We asked before how many people are coders. How many people in this room have ever printed a book they set entirely letterpress, letter by letter? Oh, we have one. Excellent. Okay. All right. So all of my books in this format were handset type and printed letterpress and involve elaborate intertextual play and format features. And that's true for that book, which is From A to Z, a book like this, which is The Word Made Flesh, again, printed letterpress, in which, again, if you try to do this in Markdown, it'll be an interesting experience, right? So all of the content will be lost as a result. And that was true for me when I started working in digital prepress as well, and using format features to structure the writing process. And I think this is a really crucial issue, and I think it's something that Lisa was touching upon, is that format does structure the writing process. We had an image of Nietzsche before. Nietzsche railed against the school essay because he said it had ruined German intellectual life, because that format was so imprinted in intellectuals from their school training that they couldn't think beyond it. So to think that format is a sort of final stage is to misunderstand the ways in which we encode the instructions for composition within the sense of where the output will eventually go. I've done a couple of online projects that involve books, real books. So this is another relationship to books in browsers. This project, Artist Books Online, which I did while I was still at the University of Virginia, it's still up, and it was a project that was designed to take artist books and explore the way that they produce meaning and function by doing 300 fully digitized books, cover all the way through, and extensive descriptive metadata. And here's a place where, again, metadata is a fascinating topic. We were trying to create metadata that forced people to think about books differently by the kinds of description they had to offer in order to contribute a project to the site. So when you ask people to think about sequence or development or openings or turnings or margins and marginalia, you're giving people a set of terms according to which they have to think about their relationship to the book experience. So Artist Books Online was my first attempt to sort of use the digital environment to offer the book experience. And again, with artist books, many of the books are non-standard in their format and features, and also are often very difficult to find and difficult to locate. So the idea was to create some kind of resource for making available materials that would be otherwise difficult to find. And it's well documented. I'm currently working, but this is not the project I'll talk about. I'm currently working on another Books and Browsers project, and this is a project at UCLA where I currently teach, actually a professor of bibliographical studies, a field in which I have no credentials, but it's not the first time I've taught in a field where I have no credentials. But we're doing a project that is using special collections materials at the University of California at Los Angeles in our libraries to create a course book and exhibits that deal with the history of the book. You may or may not know this. Some of you may have some relationship to the scholarly traditions of book history, but there's actually no good course book for studying the history of the book. There's lots of wonderful in-depth studies and so forth. So we're trying to create a kind of spine here of lessons onto which many kinds of materials can be hung and attached. So we're using the capabilities of web environments to create something that will be an online resource, a course book freely available. But the project I want to talk about is another project entirely, and it's a private passion project, as are most artists' projects. And this is a project that begins here. Okay, so what are you looking at? You are looking at a fair copy of a series of poems. The poems were written in 1963, in fact, the day that President Kennedy was shot, when I came home from school and sat at my parents' dining table and wrote these poems. The fair copy was made sometime while I was still in high school. I know that by the notebook and by the pen. I'm a writer. I write books. I publish books, lots of books. And I'm also a writer who's written a lot of books that have never been published, 250 to be more or less precise. I know, it's a plague. Lisa, you have no idea how much stuff there is that's not in the books. So I'm interested in my own archive and my own unwritten books. So I'm working on a project that is called All the Books I Ever Wrote and Never Published or Thought I Might Write. That's a pretty big number, so it'll keep expanding. And so at the present time, what I have been interested in thinking about is what relationship might a book about this project have to an online presentation of an archive. So here we have actually a different sense of what the role of an actual physical book would be to an internet project or a networked resource. So what I've been doing for the last about 6 years is, in bits and starts, because I've had a few other things to do, is to develop the design aspect of this project. The intellectual project is straightforward. I have all of these manuscripts from the time, I still have the little novels in spiral-bound notebooks written out by hand that I did when I was 12 years old, up to recent projects. So I have all of these manuscripts. What representation of them can I make in a printed book format, and what representation of them can I make online? And how can I repurpose the intellectual content that I would use in one of those environments in order to produce the other? And so that's the nature of the project. to begin, what I did was to scan representative pages from each of the manuscripts and start to make a list, right? And that led then to a spreadsheet in which each of the artifacts and each of the images has a unique ID for its, for the scan. And then I began to think about the metadata, and I started to think about maybe this project is actually a database project. And that's where it started to be interesting for me. I had thought that the memoir would be a narrative. I thought I'd write a story about myself, about these books, about their context, their conditions of conception, as well as their, sort of bits and pieces of their execution. But as I got into the project a little bit more, I realized that one of the things that was interesting to think about, and this came out of working on Artist Books Online and the History of the Book Project, was to actually consider the relationship of a database structure to narrative. And in the literary world, at least, in the literary critical world, these two things are seen very much in opposition. Publications of the Modern Language Association, the major vehicle for such debates in the fields of literary studies, had a special issue devoted to database and narrative a few years ago, in which that debate raged in such a way as to make it seem that one was either on the side of chunking or one was on the side of synthetic prose. What I found from my own engagement with this project, which then went on into a file format, I used FileMaker for a while just to organize it, was it was really interesting to me to think about how I would understand memory, lived experience, the nature of the manuscripts, the chronological chunking of one's life, the periodization of one's relationship to literature and writing as a practice, to aesthetics, to different aspects of experience, as well as different characteristics and features of the works, and organize that as a data structure as part of the process of writing a narrative. And it became clear to me that that structured data format that forced one to make certain things explicit became a kind of mechanism for articulating in synthetic narrative form what those kind of more structural features of a life might be. So it wasn't at all a binary opposition or a tension. It was very generative to think about these two things, to think about, well, what is the relationship of real people to works, what kinds of settings, and so on and so forth. I worked then with a database designer and Anna Roedinger, and she created a MySQL database for me and coded it in other kinds of ways to sort of see, well, if we're going to try to make the database be the site in which I enter all of the information about these projects, then what will be the export format that we can use? So the question of how to repurpose intellectual format so that I could have a print output as well as a web output became really compelling. In addition, one of the things I was concerned about, I'll talk about this slide in a second, was that the online format could hold all of the manuscripts. In other words, it didn't just have to have representative images. So then I began to scan the full length of all of these millions of manuscripts. And it's not like I think anyone's actually interested in the manuscripts, but I think, I'm interested in the project as a learning experience, but also as a kind of project that's like the deepest level of the author's cut, the director's cut that you could have for a book. So I settled on the idea of doing most of the writing in XML rather than in a database format, and in part because of the flexibility and the flexibility of XML and its ability to be export then into various kinds of formats that you can, in an Oxygen editor, you can basically push out EPUB and HTML and a PDF, and then you can format the PDF with various kinds of features and templates. So again, the idea is, where do you author, where do you write, and how does the engagement with these structured data environments change the way in which you, me, as an author, actually think about the creative compositional project. And so that's been really interesting to me. So I happen to love XML. If you're a format junkie, you love XML. It's, totally structured. One of the first kind of sketches for what this isn't a design, it's just a sort of a mock-up of what the site functionality would be and how it would be organized. All is the name of the project, and they have, you could sort tables of contents by sucking out from the XML, of course, just with transforms. You can have a table of contents that's by chronology, a table of contents that's by place, by theme, by genre, by title. So you have multiple tables of contents and points of entry into the same material. It's an archival approach to writing. It's an archival approach to composition. And then, thinking about, well, what materials belong here? What, how do we display the artifact itself? It has artifactual qualities. How much of the metadata would be displayed in any given environment? This is another engagement with content management systems as a way to think about the project. We developed History of the Book Online in Drupal, and Drupal's a very, very sort of demanding, has a very demanding set of disciplines that you engage with as you move through designing and building a project. So again, I found Drupal very useful to think about, again, as a way to think structure as composition, right? And so that was interesting. Ultimately gave up on Drupal for various reasons, though we are continuing to do History of the Book Online in Drupal. And then finally, I'm just coming around to thinking about, what does the web interface look like? How would somebody experience this project in a web interface? How do you offer these different modes of access, these different searches, so that when you go in, you can search according to these different categories. So once again, you're using the compositional structure that's in the data format in order to both structure the writing that you're doing and the user experience. So again, the relationship between the user experience and the data structures is always filtered, selected, and processed, but nonetheless, these two things work carefully together. So from my point of view, format is content. It's not separate from it, and it becomes the fundamental structuring conceptual armature for the project itself. And this is a little bit, it's not a great image again, but of what a page might look like. There's a kind of introductory landing page for what the project, how the project might appear in a web environment. And then the question is, what do you do with the print output? How do you create a print output? And I'm still very much in the kind of sketching mode here. But you can see that various elements from the metadata will appear as headers and footers within the different zones of the page space, and those will be content. They won't just be navigational, they'll actually be commentaries, and they will contribute to the understanding of what the text actually has to say. So for me, this experience has been really interesting. I also teach in these areas. I teach digital humanities. And I think, from my point of view, some of the useful things to be thinking about at this point in time are the ways in which a book, in this case a print output, might serve as a kind of guidebook to a web environment. And a book would be the thing you'd carry around. You would read it. It'll be a standalone artifact. You would have that particular experience. But if you wanted to go in then, you'd have a catalog, essentially, to an archive. You'd know which of these manuscripts you might actually want to look at in the full PDF. You'd want to think about the relationship of the manuscripts to each other, and how the capacities and affordances of a networked environment can be accessed through a book, the book as interface, while providing an augmented experience of the networked environment. So I think I'll stop there, and we can use the rest of the time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, questions for Lisa, Johanna?
Sure. So I have a team of developers.
Repeat the question.
The question was basically, what does this cost? And how do you deal with that internally? I have a team of developers who we keep a certain amount of bandwidth of both our production and development team that's specifically meant for testing next generation use cases. We, on a pretty regular basis, look out at the marketplace and look at, one, where are there books and authors who have interest in projects that are good opportunities, and then two, where are there genres where we want to make sure that we're able to do interesting things. So right now we're very focused on kids, on cooking, on education, and we sit down with our publishers monthly to talk about what's coming up in the next 2 years, talk about what authors have been coming to them with ideas. We keep a roadmap of possible projects. That roadmap gets whittled down as technology maybe changes or as authors maybe don't have enough time. For example, we were going to work on a great interactive version of Neil Patrick Harris's Choose Your Own Autobiography this fall. And as it turned out, Neil just didn't have the time to deliver all of the assets because he was a little bit busy with the Tonys and getting married. So, that's still on the timeline. It's still there. In terms of money, we really focus on trying to develop things quickly and nimbly, and sometimes developing things where we really build platforms around them. So like what we did for Pride and Prejudice, we have put as much money into that effort as we would have if we had built an app. But we did it in a way that is completely reusable and that all of the things that we've learned, we can amortize over the cost of the next set of books, and we know that we'll use that model for a series of titles.
Other questions? Okay.
Yeah, Liam Quinn, Worldwide Web Consulting. One of the great things about printed books, whether beautiful letterpress books or beautiful children's e-books that we've seen, is books can be a great leveling thing. Anyone can read books. So one of the things that occurred to me while I was watching the demonstrations of these books with clocks that move and with a quiz that lights up in red or green. Actually, that's a perfect example. A quiz that lights up in red or green, depending whether you pass the question. Of course, about 8% of people can't tell whether red is green or green is red. So there's a whole bunch of accessibility questions about this. And as there's this pull towards making books into programs, into applications, how do you see the future of accessibility in that world?
Accessibility is both incredibly hard and really important for trade publishing. We're in this awkward spot in trade publishing where all of the methodology we've had for all of the years that we've been making these books has never really taken that into account because somebody else did it, right? And now that we're starting to do it, it becomes this giant challenge because we really have to write a description of every single picture in the book in order to make it accessible. And then it becomes a question of who's going to write that picture and what tools are those people going to have to actually prove whether what they wrote about the picture is right or not, because you can't actually see it unless you're looking at it in one of these reading systems. When we're working on interactivity, that question of red and green comes up, and someone somewhere along the way kills it. We try to push away from it, but it's such a familiar mechanism.
But couldn't you just add a sound? I mean, couldn't you just have a distinguishing sound? There's a sound for right and a sound for wrong.
Right. Still both deaf and colorblind.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but
yeah, but that is something that as we make, we're always, I mean, then that's the other thing about these digital products is that you can't just put them down and say they're done. We know every year that we're going to have to double back to fix things that we did wrong with all the projects we worked on last year, or things where the technology got better and we can improve on it. And it makes keeping those alive a lot like maintaining software.
it is maintaining software.
Question for Johanna. And I've been trying to formulate a question. I'm not sure where I want to begin. So I'll just throw in and ask about the whole time in this project. It's a magnificent project, by the way, which is where I should have started. Really, really well coached.
Sure. Yeah. The question was about temporality, and within the project that has as many kind of chronological, biographical, autobiographical, and historical kind of cross currents, how do we think about temporality, and how does temporality become either part of the way that we access the materials or structure the materials or think about them? You probably know this, probably maybe one other person in this room knows this, but there's a project I worked on for a long time called temporal modeling that was trying to introduce a kind of humanistic understanding of time and temporality into visualization, and to think about multiple scales and malleable scales and timelines with gaps and timelines that have anticipation, regret, remorse, and so forth built into them. And so again, in thinking about the different kinds of temporal, sort of organizational frameworks that can emerge here, they're the ones that come out of the structured data. Again, I made a distinction between periodization and chronology. The chronology has a kind of literal temporality, and periodization tends to be more of an extent or a duration, and there might be overlapping periods within a chronological sequence, things like that. And certainly the history of technology here, it's like, all the typewriters I ever owned, when somebody was showing that IBM workstation, I thought, that's an IBM Model B. I had that typewriter, that one that looks kind of like a VW bug, or a tank, the offspring of a relationship between a VW bug and a tank. And so I think, to me, the part of what happens is that the way that the metadata fields allow one to structure multiple kinds of chronological and temporal organizational filters becomes a way to disturb the kind of literal temporality that's built into, most timelines, like the Roosevelt thing, which again, no offense intended, but make me cringe, because, at least I didn't say homicidal. I'm reserving that. So, deeper crimes. But, again, temporality is not linear, and it's not standard, and especially within human experience, it's not unidirectional, and it doesn't unfold according to a single metric. So lots to think about. That's a really good question. The question is, if we look at the history of publishing technology and the relationship between publishing and technology in the broadest sense of its historical evolution and development, then what do we make of the current situation where we have these big three of Amazon and so on, and what do we think will happen in the future? Well, I'm not a fortune teller, so I should just sort of duck the question and leave the podium. But, I think the great thing about human communities and human imagination is that it's opportunistic, and so the possibilities for independent thought, creative thought, marginal communities of practice. Think about the zine culture, which is alive and thriving. It's just huge. You think about all the kind of mashup cultures. You think about, the kind of fan cultures that, come into being that take game engines and then do completely different things with them and make communities of ongoing creative activity through those things. So, I think it is, I think that, a culture thrives more, as any ecology does, when you have have lots of diversity within it. And so I think it's beholden on those of us who can support such diversity to try to foster it where we see it. And, to be vigilant as, in many ways towards, trying to advocate for keeping open the means of access to visibility within the larger marketplace of that independent thought. So I guess, from my point of view, in terms of the values I espouse, that's exceedingly useful in a culture, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, to have diversity of point of view made visible. And I think the worst thing we could do is, it's the privatization of the net is really terrifying. And these, inequities that are becoming built into delivery rates and bandwidths, because, again, what does that do to efface the visibility of alternative voices? So I didn't really answer your question, just advocated for a position. But thanks for the question.
So this was an inspiring juxtaposition of thoughts. Thank you both, and thank you, Peter, for scheduling it. Both of you are creating new digital artifacts, new cultural artifacts. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about the preservation of those artifacts? The way we've been able to preserve the printed artifacts so well, or equally disturbing, the notes of a 12-year-old today. Would she be able to access them 10, 15 years from now?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I'm so glad you asked that question. The question was about, as we create new digital artifacts, what do we think about preservation and the sustainability of those materials? If I were that same scribbling 12-year-old today and doing all of my obsessive work in a digital environment, what are the chances that 50 years later I would be able to, or 10 years later? So, yes, there's a principle I was going to mention in my talk and forgot to. I store all of my intellectual content in file formats that are as standard as possible. And I just think absolutely do not ever let your content get bound into a platform or a format. In other words, XML, HTML. And it's not that it's, guaranteed against obsolescence, and again, I'd be interested to hear responses from the people who work more closely within the industry, but my feeling is that the more generic the format and the closer it is to HTML, the more likely it is to survive and be migrated forward. So one of the reasons I work in XML is that I preserve all the content in TIFF and XML in every project that we do, all the intellectual content. None of it is ever stored in a platform. So nothing lives in Drupal, PowerPoint, Omeka, Scalar, none of those things. But so that to me is a philosophical principle according to which we structure all of our workflow. But it's all going to be it's all at risk for obsolescence, to be sure. Do you have a?
Sure. It's a sad thing because we talk to librarians who are trying to maintain this history, and so much of it is tied into the devices. And I've been working on this stuff for 16 years at Penguin Random House and can tell you that I've still got all of those original Rocketbook and Softbook files, but I don't have any way to get those devices to charge up anymore. And those files aren't really easily read by anything anymore. And though we have an archive of all of the versions that a file has been through in the book's life cycle, being able to maintain the changes between those things and actually have an archival history of them is not something that in the trying to just get to digital has been a big focus. And so we're really happy that there are librarians who are focused on it and happy on supporting those libraries, but it's a very hard challenge.
Are you doing anything special on your Penguin platforms to make it more likely that the artifacts you're producing?
We do structure tag our manuscripts. And we do keep all of that structure tagging. There is a certain amount of content that changes between that and the design form of it, and we keep all of those things. We keep all of the ebook output that has been generated from that, and we keep all of the versions of it and have never lost any piece of those things. But it's and we certainly we have this constant ongoing effort as standards change to go back and update. So every 3 or 4 years, we run back through the entire catalog and fix things. And we actually are likely to do that again soon for EPUB 3, because there are a lot of things that we've changed about our specification, about the way that we're handling navigation, the way that we're dealing with the color of links, the way that we're using HTML for certain character sets, where we originally coded things to work on these really crappy e-ink devices that did not really do HTML. And now a lot of them do. So we will be updating those and pushing the catalog back out to update it, and that hopefully is great for people that they get updated versions that look better on device. But it's not a historical thing so much as it's a software update thing.
Just to say, we're training a lot of digital archivists. Right, and because again, there's so many interesting issues in what one does with this. If you merely migrate the materials forward, even though that's a useful aspect of quote-unquote preservation, there's also, the nature of those formats and their clock speed, the clock speeds of different platforms and the constraints according to which these things were produced. So there's people who do media archaeology who are actually really interested in this kind of, retrospective experience as well. So it's a rich area to think about.
Okay, so we're at the end of our time. So thank you for Lisa and Johanna for the talk. So that's it for today. Tomorrow we reconvene. Doors open again at 8 and sessions start at 9. If on your way out tonight, if you could help us clean up, if you've got stuff around your chairs, if you could pick it up and deposit it outside in the trash, we'd really appreciate it. And feel free to form groups and flood into the Mission District.